The letter that arrived back in Millhaven, Kansas, in the spring of 1882 was not the letter Nathan Hudson had sent, and that single, unsettling fact would change the course of his entire life in ways he could never have predicted when he first set ink to paper and asked a stranger to become his wife. Nathan Hudson was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, and sun-darkened from years of working land that did not give itself easily to any man. He owned 400 acres of decent cattle country just outside the town of Callow Creek, a place barely old enough to have a proper name, sitting in the middle of the Colorado Territory where the grass turned gold in summer and the winters arrived without apology. He had built his ranch house himself, log by log, and he had filled the larder himself, and he had mended every fence post himself. And at the end of each long evening he sat down to a table set for one, and felt the silence of the place close around him like a second skin that did not quite fit. He had not gone looking for a mail-order arrangement out of laziness or desperation, though some men did. He had gone looking because the women of Callow Creek were few, and the ones who were unmarried were either spoken for, too young by years, or had made it plainly clear they wanted no part of a man who smelled of cattle and came in from the fields with his hands cracked and his boots caked with mud. He could not blame them for that. He was, by his own honest measure, not the most romantic prospect. He was steady and hardworking and decent, but steady, hardworking and decent did not make a man's pulse race in a woman's chest. So he had written to a matrimonial agency out of St. Louis, the kind that advertised in newspapers back east and promised to match frontier men with women of good character who were prepared for the realities of Western life. He had been honest in his letter. He had described his ranch, his cattle, the distance to the nearest town, the harshness of the winters, the isolation of the days. He had said plainly that he was not a rich man, but that he was a reliable one, and that any woman who came to him could expect to be treated with respect. He had asked for a woman of practical nature, willing to work, somewhere around his own age. The agency had written back within 2 weeks to say they had found a match. Her name was Clara Simmons. She was 26 years old. She was from a farming family in Ohio. She was accustomed to hard labor, and she had agreed to make the journey to Colorado Territory in the month of April. A date had been set. A stagecoach route had been agreed upon. Nathan had written a brief, polite letter to Clara Simmons herself, introducing himself again in his own words, and telling her he would meet her at the Callow Creek station on the 14th day of April. He had received, in return, a letter that was ostensibly from Clara Simmons, but that read, looking back on it now, with a certain stiffness, a certain formality that he had attributed to nervousness at the time. The handwriting was neat and careful. The words were appropriate. She said she was looking forward to the journey and that she hoped to be a good partner to him. He had folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and thought, well, this is how it starts, I suppose. What Nathan Hudson did not know, and would not know until the stagecoach rolled into Callow Creek on the afternoon of April the 14th, was that Clara Simmons had, at some point between the writing of that letter and the arrival of the stage, decided she could not go through with it. She had told no one. She had not written to Nathan. She had not written to the agency. She had simply, quietly, decided that marrying a stranger in Colorado Territory was not the life she wanted, and she had stayed in Ohio. The woman who stepped off the stagecoach in her place was named Theodora Fletcher, and she was 27 years old, and she had never been to Colorado in her life, and she had not, strictly speaking, been sent by the agency at all. The story of how Theodora Fletcher came to be standing on the dusty platform of the Callow Creek stagecoach station on that bright April afternoon, clutching a worn leather travel bag and squinting against the sharp western sun, was this. She had been traveling on the same stage as Clara Simmons was supposed to travel on, making her way west from St. Louis toward Denver, where she had a distant cousin who had offered her work as a schoolteacher. She and Clara had met at the St. Louis depot 3 days before, while waiting for the coach. Clara had been tearful and wrung with guilt, and had confessed the whole situation to Theodora over a shared meal, explaining that she simply could not do it. She could not marry a man she had never met. She was sorry. She knew it was wrong, but she could not help herself. Theodora, who had a practical mind and a compassionate heart in equal measure, had listened to the whole story without judgment. She had asked the sensible questions. She had helped Clara think through her options. And then, somewhere in the course of that long conversation, something had shifted inside Theodora Fletcher's chest that she could not quite name. She was not fleeing anything precisely, though her circumstances in St. Louis had been difficult enough for the past year since her father's passing had left her without resources and without the secure future she had planned. The teaching position in Denver was not guaranteed. Her cousin's letters had been vague and had grown vaguer. She was traveling west with $32, a bag of clothes, 2 books, and a determined optimism that had begun, if she was honest, to feel slightly threadbare. Clara had told her everything about Nathan Hudson. She had shown her his letter. Theodora had read it twice, slowly, and something about the plain honesty of his words had settled into her like warm water into cold ground. He had not promised wealth. He had not promised ease. He had promised respect and reliability, and those were 2 things Theodora Fletcher valued above almost all others, because they were 2 things she had not always had. When the stage prepared to depart the following morning, and Clara Simmons was notably absent from it, Theodora had made a decision that was, by any reasonable measure, either the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. She had climbed aboard, and she had traveled 3 days across the increasingly wild and beautiful country of the Colorado Territory, and she had arrived at the Callow Creek station on the 14th of April, and she was standing there now, in her second-best dress, which was a deep green cotton with small white buttons, her brown hair pulled up under a sensible hat, watching Nathan Hudson walk toward her from the shade of the livery stable across the dirt street. He was taller than she had expected, though she did not know why she had formed a picture of him in her mind based on a letter alone. He had dark hair and a jaw that needed a shave and eyes that were a shade of gray she associated with the sky before rain. He was wearing a clean shirt, which told her he had made an effort, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head in a way that made him look less severe than he might otherwise have. He was scanning the platform, clearly looking for someone who matched the description he had been given of Clara Simmons, who had reportedly been fair-haired and shorter than average. Theodora took a breath. She had rehearsed this moment 40 times during the 3-day journey. She had not yet, in any version of her rehearsals, found the perfect way to begin it. Nathan reached the platform and looked at the passengers who had disembarked, and his gaze swept past Theodora once, then returned to her because she was looking directly at him, and there was something in her expression that was simultaneously apologetic and composed, and it was not the expression of a woman simply waiting for someone to fetch her luggage. He stopped. He tilted his head very slightly. He said, "Miss Simmons." And Theodora Fletcher said, "No. But I think you need to hear what I have to tell you before you decide to put me back on that coach." He stared at her for a long moment. The stagecoach driver was unloading luggage behind them with cheerful indifference to the drama unfolding on the platform. The April sun was brilliant and merciless. A horse tied to the rail outside the general store flicked its ears at a fly. Nathan said slowly, "Where is Clara Simmons?" "In Ohio," Theodora said. "She decided she could not come. I am sorry. I know this is not what you were expecting. My name is Theodora Fletcher. I was on the same coach that Miss Simmons was supposed to travel on. She told me everything about the arrangement, and I read your letter, and I came the rest of the way. I am fully aware of how unusual this is, and I am not asking you for anything other than 10 minutes of your time to explain myself before you make any decisions." He looked at her for a long moment that felt to Theodora like it lasted considerably longer than it actually did. She watched something work through his expression: surprise, frustration, a flash of something that might have been hurt, and then slowly a kind of careful neutrality that she would come to recognize over the weeks that followed as the expression Nathan Hudson wore when he was thinking seriously about something. He said, "You had better come and sit down somewhere." The somewhere turned out to be the small dining room of the Callow Creek Hotel, which was one of 6 buildings that constituted the main street of the town. The hotel also served as a meeting room and occasional courtroom, and on Saturday evenings as a dance hall, which gave it a slightly schizophrenic character that Theodora found oddly charming. They sat at a corner table, and a woman with flour on her apron brought them coffee without being asked, which told Theodora that coffee appearing without request was simply the custom here, and she appreciated it immediately. Nathan Hudson sat across from her with his hat on the table beside him and his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he said, "Tell me the whole story." So she did. She told him about meeting Clara at the St. Louis depot, about the conversation over supper, about reading his letter. She told him about her own situation, honestly and without embellishment, her father's death the previous spring, the loss of the small house they had rented, the teaching position in Denver that was less certain than she had originally hoped. She told him she had $32 to her name, and she was not telling him that to solicit sympathy, only to establish that she had not come here under any illusion about her circumstances. She told him she had read his letter 3 times on the journey west, and that she thought the man who had written it was exactly the kind of man she would have chosen if she had been choosing. She told him she did not know what he wanted from a marriage beyond what he had written, and she did not know what she could offer beyond what she was, but she was asking for the chance to have a conversation, not a commitment, just a conversation. And if at the end of it he decided she was not suitable, she would accept that and find her own way to Denver. When she finished speaking, Nathan was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup between his hands. Outside the window, a wagon rolled slowly down the main street, and 2 men standing in front of the general store were arguing about something with the easy comfort of people who had been arguing about the same thing for years. Nathan said, "You did a very unusual thing." "I know," Theodora said. "You came 3 days by stagecoach to find a man you have never met, knowing he was expecting someone else with no guarantee of anything at the end of it." "Yes. That is either very brave or very reckless," he said. "I am aware it could be both," she said. He almost smiled. She could see it happen at the corner of his mouth, not a full smile, not yet, but the beginning of one, which she thought was a good sign. He said, "Tell me one thing that isn't in what you just described. Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with your circumstances." The question surprised her. She considered it seriously because he had asked it seriously. She said, "I can name every constellation visible from the northern hemisphere and tell you the mythology behind most of them. My father taught me. We used to sit on the porch on summer evenings and he would tell me the stories while I found the stars. I have not had a porch to sit on in over a year, but I have not forgotten any of them." Nathan looked at her steadily. Then he said, "My ranch has a porch. It faces west, so you get the whole sky from it after dark." "That is a considerable selling point," Theodora said. This time he did smile fully, and it changed his whole face in a way that made Theodora's carefully maintained composure feel suddenly less stable than she had thought it was. He said, "I need a day to think. I cannot pretend this is a normal situation because it is not. I will put you up at the hotel tonight, and I will come back tomorrow morning and we will talk again." "That is fair," Theodora said. "It is the most I can offer right now," he said, and he said it with a directness that she found unexpectedly refreshing, because she had spent too much of her life around people who dressed their uncertainties up in false promises. "I know," she said. "I am not asking for more." He paid for the coffee and he paid for her room at the hotel, which she noted with some internal calculation as an act of basic decency rather than obligation. And he put his hat back on, and he walked out into the sharp April light and did not look back, which she also noted. because it was the walk of a man who was genuinely thinking, not performing. Theodora went up to the small, clean room she had been given and set her bag on the bed and went to the window and looked out at the street below. Callow Creek was not much to look at in the conventional sense. The buildings were raw and new and clearly built by men who valued function over elegance. The street was unpaved, and the spring mud had been churned by wagon wheels into ridges and valleys, and the surrounding country was vast and wind-scoured, and so enormous it made her feel, for a moment, very small. But the sky above it was enormous too, and even in the afternoon it had a color and depth she had not seen in any city she had ever lived in, and the mountains to the west were still white with snow at their peaks, and the air smelled of grass and distance, and Theodora Fletcher, who had been exhausted and frightened and uncertain for longer than she wanted to admit, felt something quietly loosen in her chest. She thought about Nathan Hudson's gray eyes. She thought about the way he had asked her to tell him something that had nothing to do with her circumstances. She thought that a man who asked that kind of question was a man who understood that people were more than their troubles. She went asleep early and slept more soundly than she had in months. Nathan Hudson drove his wagon back to his ranch that evening and sat on the westward-facing porch for a long time after dark, doing exactly what he needed to do, which was think. He was a methodical thinker by nature. He did not arrive at conclusions quickly, but the ones he arrived at tended to be ones he could stand behind. He thought about what he had expected, and about what had actually arrived, and about the difference between the two. He had expected a woman who checked the boxes he had listed. He had received, instead, a woman who had read his letter and gotten on a stagecoach based on what she found there. That was not a small thing. A woman who had nothing to fall back on and had gambled those $32 and 3 days of her life on the character of a man she knew only from one honest letter. That was a woman who valued the same things he valued. That was a woman whose judgment, regardless of everything else, he could respect. He was also, in the privacy of the dark porch with the stars coming out above the mountains, willing to admit to himself that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with prettiness, though she was that too. It was the way she had looked at him directly, all the way through, without deflection or performance. It was the way her voice had been steady even when the content of what she was saying was clearly costing her something. It was the small breath she had taken before she said the first sentence to him on that platform, the one that told him she was nervous but had decided to go ahead anyway. He sat on the porch until the Big Dipper was high and clear above him, and he thought of what she had said about the constellations, and he thought that a woman who could name every constellation and tell their stories was a woman who paid attention to things that most people walked past without noticing, and that was a quality he valued even more than he had known to ask for. In the morning he drove back to town. She was waiting at the table in the hotel dining room when he came in, with a cup of coffee already in front of her and a small worn book open beside it. She closed the book when she saw him. She did not try to look as though she had not been watching the door. He sat down across from her. He said, "I would like to propose something that is perhaps not the arrangement you came here expecting either." "Go ahead," she said. "I would like you to come to the ranch," he said. Not yet as the arrangement that was originally intended. "I would like to give us both a month to get to know each other properly. You would have your own room. There is no obligation. If at the end of the month either of us feels it is not right, then we part ways honorably and I will pay your passage to Denver." Theodora looked at him steadily. She said, "And if at the end of the month both of us feel it is right, then we discuss what comes next," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think that is a very sensible proposal." "I am a very sensible man," he said, and there was the quarter smile again. "I have noticed," she said, and she thought she saw a small warmth come into those gray eyes that had not been there yesterday, and she felt a corresponding warmth rise in her own chest that she did not try to suppress. So that was how it began. Nathan Hudson put Theodora Fletcher's worn leather bag into the back of his wagon, and drove her out of Callow Creek along a dirt road that ran between sage-brushed hills and occasional clusters of cottonwood trees, following the line of a creek that still ran high with snowmelt. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road, a solid log house, low and long, with that westward-facing porch he had mentioned, and a large barn beyond it, and fenced pasture stretching away toward the hills, and a cook fire still sending a thread of smoke into the morning sky. "It is not much to look at," Nathan said. "I think it is exactly right," Theodora said, and she meant it. He showed her the room she would use, which was small but clean, and had a window that looked out over the east pasture where the morning light was good. He showed her the kitchen and the pantry and the well and the root cellar. He showed her the barn with its 8 cattle horses and the 4 milk cows and the 2 dozen or so range cattle in the near pasture. He explained the daily routine of the ranch in the same tone he used for everything, direct and matter-of-fact and without condescension, as if he assumed she was capable of understanding all of it, which she was. She asked intelligent questions. She always asked intelligent questions. He would come to learn. She wanted to understand how things worked, not because she needed to manage everything herself, but because she found the functioning of systems genuinely interesting. She asked about the water source and the nearest neighbors and the growing season and the trade route to Callow Creek, and he answered all of it. And somewhere in the course of that first morning tour of the property, the stiffness of 2 strangers negotiating an uncertain situation began, gradually, to ease. His ranch hand, a weathered man of 50-some years named Pete Sargent, who had been with Nathan since before the ranch house was finished, came in from the morning work and was introduced to Theodora with the blunt courtesy of a man who was not going to pretend to be more formal than he was. He said, "Pleased to meet you, Miss Fletcher," and gave Nathan a sideways look that communicated a volume of unspoken commentary, and Nathan gave him back a look that communicated that the commentary was not required, and Pete went back outside. The first weeks were a careful, gradual, and occasionally awkward discovery. They worked alongside each other without being asked to. Theodora took over the cooking without discussion, because it needed doing and she was good at it, and Nathan rebuilt a section of the east fence without discussion, because it needed doing and he was good at it, and they each understood that the other was contributing without making a negotiation of it. That felt important to both of them, though neither said so directly for some time. She found that he was a man of few words but careful ones. He did not speak unless he had something to say, and when he spoke, it was worth listening to. She found that he was quietly funny in a way that was easy to miss if you were not paying attention, and she was paying attention. She found that he was patient with difficulty in the way that only people who have faced real difficulty tend to be, without drama or complaint, but with a thoroughness that suggested he had learned the hard way that difficulties did not go away simply because you were annoyed by them. He found that she was not what he had expected and was better than what he had expected, and he found himself going back to that fact repeatedly in the evenings when he sat on the porch. Clara Simmons, by the description the agency had given, had been suited to the practical requirements of the life he was offering, but Theodora Fletcher, as she actually was, suited something deeper than the practical requirements, something he had not known to put in a letter because he had not known himself that it was what he was missing. She brought things alive, not loudly, not performatively, but in the way of a person who was genuinely alive themselves, curious, attentive, capable of delight. On the 3rd evening at the ranch, she sat down on the porch steps beside him after supper, and without preamble began identifying the constellations as they appeared, naming them in English and in the Latin, and telling the stories behind them in a voice that was quiet and easy, the way a person talks when they are not performing, but simply sharing something they love. He listened and watched the stars, and thought that the porch had been waiting for this, specifically this, for longer than it had existed. He showed her things in return. He showed her which clouds meant weather coming and which meant nothing. He showed her how to read the creek level to know about the snowmelt in the mountains. He showed her the spot on the South Ridge where, on clear mornings, you could see the next county's land spreading out to the horizon in a shade of gold that looked, he said, like something you should not be allowed to look at for free. She stood on that ridge on a morning in late April, with the wind moving through her hair and the world spread out enormous and brilliant below, and she said, "I understand why you stayed here." He said, "Most people from back east think it is too empty." She said, "They are looking at it wrong. It is not empty, it is full of space. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment and then looked back at the view and said, "Yes," and the single word felt significant in a way that neither of them commented on. The town of Callow Creek had opinions, of course. Small frontier towns in 1882 ran partly on information and partly on speculation about information, and the arrival of a woman who was not the woman who had been advertised for was the kind of story that moved through a town like creek water through a sluice, quickly, and in every direction. Nathan was aware of the talk. He had lived in Callow Creek long enough to know that talk did not require encouragement and could not be stopped by disapproval, and so he ignored it with the same methodical patience he applied to everything else. Theodora was made aware of it by the general store owner's wife, a brisk and not unkind woman named Harriet Plum, who was the sort of person who delivered gossip as though it were a public service. Harriet told Theodora, during her second visit to the store, that there were those in town who thought the whole arrangement was irregular and not entirely proper, and that people were talking. Theodora thanked her for the information and bought her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and on the way back to the wagon she thought about what it meant to be a woman in 1882, whose choices were always subject to the approval of people who had no stake in the consequences of those choices. She had thought about this before, many times. She had thought about it when her father's death had left her with no legal claim to the house they had shared because the lease was in his name. She had thought about it when the teaching agency Incent. Louis had told her that positions outside of cities were reserved for married women because unmarried women could not be trusted to maintain proper discipline. She had thought about it on the 3-day stagecoach ride west, wondering what would happen to her if she arrived at Nathan Hudson's ranch and he turned her away, because the options available to a woman alone in the Colorado Territory in 1882 were not numerous. She did not say any of this to Nathan directly for some time. But one evening in the third week, when they had settled into the comfortable habit of sitting on the porch after supper while the light died over the mountains, she told him about the teaching agency and its policy about married and unmarried women. She told him without anger, in the same tone she used for everything, which was clear and direct and unadorned. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "That is not right." "No," she said. "A woman's competence at a thing should not depend on whether or not she has a husband," he said. "I agree with you," she said. "Then I am glad," he said, "that you chose to come here rather than wait around for an agency to decide you were qualified." He said it quietly, and he said it looking at the mountains rather than at her, but the weight of it landed exactly where it should, and Theodora felt it settle in her chest with a warmth that was becoming familiar. In the fourth week, they had their first real disagreement, which was about the roof of the barn. One of the sections of the roof had been damaged by a late-season snow, and Nathan had planned to patch it in a specific way that Theodora, after studying the damage carefully, believed was insufficient. She told him so. He disagreed, politely but firmly. She held her ground. He held his. They went back and forth for the better part of an evening, both of them thorough and neither of them willing to concede a point they genuinely believed was correct. In the end, Nathan climbed up and examined the damaged section more carefully, and he came back down and told her she was right, and that his original plan would have held for a season but not two, and that he would do it her way. He said it without embarrassment, which impressed her as much as anything had. A man who could say you were right without finding it threatening was a rarer thing than it ought to be. She said, How did you know I was looking at it correctly? You could not see what I was seeing from where you were, he said. I know that you do not say things you are not sure of. I have been watching you for 3 weeks, and you do not tell people what you think unless you have good reason for thinking it. So when you disagreed with me, I knew you had thought it through. The silence after that felt warm and full of something that was no longer uncertainty. At the end of the 4th week, Nathan came in from the range at noon, which he never did. He was always out until late afternoon and found Theodora in the kitchen making bread, which meant her hands were covered in flour and she had a streak of it on her left cheek, and the kitchen smelled enormously good. He stood in the doorway for a moment and she turned and saw him and said, "Is something wrong?" he said. "The month is nearly up." She looked at him. Her hands were still in the dough. He said, "I know we said we would discuss what came next at the end of the month. I find I do not want to wait until the end of the month." Theodora set the dough down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at him very steadily and she said, "What is it that you want to say?" He came into the kitchen and stood at the table across from her and said, "I want to ask you to stay. Not as the arrangement I had originally planned, not as a practical solution to a practical problem, but because the past 4 weeks have been the best 4 weeks this ranch has seen. And I believe that is because of you. And I do not want you to get on a stage to Denver and take all of that with you." Theodora was quiet for a moment. She felt the warmth in her chest spread outward until it was something larger and more complex than warmth. It was the feeling of a door opening that she had thought might be permanently closed, and it was slightly terrifying and entirely welcome. She said, "You are asking me to marry you," he said. "I am asking you to consider it." She said, "I have been considering it since the 3rd night on the porch when you sat next to me and listened to the whole story of Cassiopeia without once looking like you wanted me to stop talking." Something lit up in his face that she had not seen before, something open and unguarded that was much more vulnerable than his usual expression, and it made her heart turn over in a way she had not expected to feel for a man she had known less than a month. He said, "Is that a yes?" she said. "It is a yes." He did not, in the way of the romantic stories she had read in the dime novels that circulated through the boarding houses of St. Louis, sweep her into his arms immediately. He was Nathan Hudson, who did things properly and with care, and so he came around the table and he took her flour-dusted hand in both of his, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that were the color of good weather coming, and he said, "I need you to know that I understand this is a larger leap for you than for me. You gave up a great deal to come here on very little certainty, and I am not going to take that lightly." Theodora felt something fill in her throat that was perilously close to tears, though she was not a woman who cried easily, and she said, "I did not give up anything I valued as much as what I found here." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it with a formality that was entirely sincere, and the gentleness of it was so unexpected and so precisely right that the tears she had been suppressing won the argument briefly, and she did not try too hard to stop them. They were married on a Saturday in May at the small church in Callow Creek, which was also the schoolhouse and occasionally the meeting hall, which gave it the same adaptable quality as the hotel, and which Theodora found, again, charming rather than makeshift. Reverend Birch, who was a thin man of 60 with a voice like a pipe organ in a small room, performed the ceremony with genuine pleasure, because weddings were among the few occasions in Callow Creek that required no diplomacy. Pete Sargent was Nathan's witness, and he spent the whole ceremony looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man exercising heroic emotional restraint. Harriet Plum came and brought half a dozen other women from town, and the gossip about irregularity was, if not forgotten, at least overtaken by the more immediate fact that Nathan Hudson looked at Theodora Fletcher, the way a man looks at something he is determined not to lose, and Theodora Fletcher looked back at him with an expression that was composed and direct and utterly devoted, and even the most skeptical of Harriet Plum's companions had to concede that this did not look like a mistake. The summer came on fast and glorious, the way summer does in the Colorado Territory when it finally decides to arrive, and Theodora learned the rhythm of the ranch as thoroughly and as happily as she had ever learned anything. She learned to ride, which she had not done before, on a steady chestnut mare Nathan called Tuesday, who was forgiving of errors and responsive to kindness. She learned the particular language of cattle work, the calls and signals and movements that turned a large and uncooperative animal in the direction you needed it to go. She helped with the haying in late June, which was hard work under a brutal sun, and she did it without complaint and kept up with Pete, which earned her a level of respect from that taciturn man that expressed itself as a slightly less economical use of words when he spoke to her. Nathan watched her all of it with the steady, quiet attention of a man who had not known he was capable of being this interested in another person. He had always been content in his own company content, not happy, and there was a distinction he had not fully understood until the distinction became concrete. The ranch had been his, and he had been proud of it and had found meaning in the work of it. Now the ranch was theirs, which was a different thing entirely, and the meaning had expanded in ways he had not anticipated. He came in one evening to find her at the kitchen table with one of his account books open and a slate beside it, working through a set of figures he had been planning to get to on Sunday. She looked up when he came in and said, "Your feed costs are running higher than they should relative to the grazing output. I think you are overwintering more cattle than your summer pasture actually supports, and then paying to supplement feed through the season. If you reduced the herd by about 12 head and rotated the south pasture through a 2-year rest, I believe you would come out ahead within 3 seasons. He took off his hat and hung it on the hook and looked at the figures she had laid out and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "Where did you learn to read accounts like that?" She said, "My father kept the books for a grain merchant for 12 years. He taught me because he said it was a skill a woman would always need whether anyone admitted it or not." Nathan looked at the figures again, and then he looked at her, and he said, "Your father was a wise man." "He was," she said, and there was a small shadow in her expression that passed quickly, because she had made a kind of peace with the grief of it, though it lived in her still. He sat down across from her, and they went through the figures together, and by the end of the evening they had worked out a plan for the herd rotation that Nathan estimated would put them in a substantially better position by the winter of 1883. He told her this was exactly the kind of thinking the ranch needed, and she told him she was glad to be useful, and he told her that useful was a small word for what she was. She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them, and she said, "Nathan." "Yes." "I want you to know that I am not sorry I came here. I want you to know that whatever it looked like from the outside, from the inside it was the most right decision I have ever made." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "From where I am sitting, it looked right too." They sat like that for a while in the warm lamp light with the accounts between them and the night pressing quiet against the windows, and it was one of those ordinary moments that is, somehow, precisely a love story. In the fall of 1882, a difficulty arrived in the form of a man named Decker Holt. Decker Holt was not an enemy exactly, not the kind of villain from a dime novel who existed purely to cause trouble, but he was a man of the sort that frontier towns tended to produce when they were young, and the law was not yet firmly established. A man who occupied the space between legal and illegal with comfortable ease, and who had been pressing Nathan and several other smaller ranchers in the area to sell their water rights to a land development company operating out of Denver that wanted to build a dam project on the Upper Creek. The pressure had been there for 2 years, Nathan told Theodora, and he had resisted it, because without the water rights the ranch was worth considerably less, and the creek water was essential for the south pasture through the dry months of late summer. But Decker Holt was the kind of man who did not simply stop pressing because you said no, and in October he came to the ranch with 2 men behind him and made what he described as a final offer. Nathan met him in the yard. Theodora was in the kitchen and heard the voices and came to the porch, and she stood there with her arms folded and watched. Holt's final offer was not significantly better than his previous offers, but he delivered it with a studied pleasantness that was more threatening than anger would have been. He said the development company was going to proceed regardless, and that those who cooperated would be compensated, and those who did not would find the legal and bureaucratic landscape becoming increasingly complicated for them. Nathan said, quietly and without raising his voice, that he was not interested. Holt looked past Nathan at Theodora on the porch. He said, with the specific kind of condescension that some men use toward women as a conversational weapon, "Does your wife have a say in this?" "It is her home too." Theodora came down from the porch and stood beside Nathan and said, without heat, "My husband has spoken clearly. He does not need me to repeat it for him, but I am happy to add that I agree with every word." Holt smiled in a way that was not a smile and rode away with his two men, and Nathan stood in the yard watching them go with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides. Theodora said, "What will he do?" Nathan said, "He will try something else. He always does." But the law in the territory is moving in the right direction now. There is a land office in Callow Creek, and Holt knows that the registration of water rights is now a matter of record. He cannot simply take what he wants anymore. "But he will still try," she said. "He will still try," Nathan agreed. What Holt did was attempt, through the land office, to challenge the original registration of Nathan's water rights on the grounds that the documentation was deficient. This was a legal maneuver rather than a physical one, but it had real consequences. It tied up the rights in a dispute that meant Nathan could not use them as collateral while they were contested, which created financial pressure at precisely the time of year when the ranch needed to be preparing for winter. Nathan went to Callow Creek and hired a lawyer, a young man named David Ash who had arrived in town 6 months earlier from a legal practice in Santa Fe, and who was sharp and energetic, and had, as it turned out, dealt with Decker Holt's methodology once before. David Ash told Nathan that the challenge was legally thin but procedurally annoying, and that it would take 3 months to resolve through the proper channels, and that in the meantime Nathan should document everything. Theodora became the documentation. She was organized and thorough and had a clear, precise hand, and she went through every record Nathan owned and created a comprehensive accounting of the water rights history that David Ash called, when she brought it to him, the most coherent property record he had seen in 3 years of territory law. He said, "Mrs. Hudson, if I may ask, where did you learn to do this?" She said, "My father kept books for 12 years and I helped him. And I had 3 months on a stagecoach and in a hotel room with nothing to do but read his letter and think carefully about things." David Ash looked at her with genuine admiration and said, "The man wrote a very good letter if this is the result." Theodora smiled and said, "He did." The dispute was resolved in January of 1883, as David Ash had predicted, in Nathan's favor, because the documentation was airtight and Holt's challenge was exactly as legally thin as the lawyer had said. Holt did not take it further. The development company shifted its attention to other properties, and the water rights remained with the ranch, and the threat that had hung over the autumn was lifted with the winter. Nathan came home from the land office on the day the decision was handed down and told Theodora, and she set down the pot she was carrying and embraced him with a straightforwardness that still managed to catch him off guard every time, because she was not a woman who held her feelings at careful distance. He held her in the kitchen in January with the cold pressing against the windows and the stove going warm and bright, and he said, against her hair, "I would have lost that without what you put together." She said, "You would have found another way." "Maybe," he said, "but not as quickly and not as cleanly, you should know that." She drew back and looked at him and said, "I know that we found it together. That is what I want you to know." He looked at her for a long moment and then kissed her, which he did with the same quality he brought to everything, thoroughly and without hurry, as if this were the most important thing currently happening, which, as far as he was concerned, it was. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, as Colorado Territory winters tended to be, but the ranch was well provisioned because they had planned for it carefully, and the log walls of the house were solid, and the fireplace drew well. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other. Nathan had a small collection of books, and Theodora had her two from the travel bag, and David Ashe had a lending library of sorts at his office from which they borrowed periodically. They played cards with Pete on the nights when the cold drove him in from the bunkhouse, and Theodora taught them both a card game her father had learned from a riverboat man in Cincinnati that neither of them had heard of, and that Pete declared, after losing 3 hands in a row, was probably cheating. Theodora laughed at that in a way that Nathan had come to love, sudden and genuine and entirely unguarded, the laugh of a person who has decided to be fully present in the moment, and he caught Pete looking at him with an expression that was as close to sentimental as that man ever got. And Pete, when he noticed Nathan noticing, became very interested in his cards. In the spring of 1883, Theodora told Nathan she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March, and she told him directly, which was how she told him everything. She watched his face as she said it and saw the surprise, and then, following close behind the surprise, something that opened in his expression like a window being pushed out on a fresh morning. He got up from the table and came around to her and took both her hands and looked at her and said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" She said, "I feel entirely well. I feel better than I have in weeks, actually, now that I have told you." He sat down beside her and held her hands and said, "A family." "I had not let myself think about it too specifically," she said. "I have been thinking about it since January." He said, she said, "and I think it is exactly right. I think this is a place that should have children in it. I think that porch deserves to have someone to teach the constellations too." He looked at her for a long moment, and his throat worked with something he was not going to put into words just then, because he was not yet, at 30 years old, a man who found the large feelings easy to articulate. But she saw it in his face, the whole of it, the gratitude and the love and the quiet awe of a man who had asked a stranger to come to his ranch and had received instead everything he had not known to ask for, and she squeezed his hands and said, "I know. You always know," he said. "I pay attention," she said. Pete, when informed, said, "Well," and went and patched the section of fence he had been putting off for 3 months, which was his way of celebrating. The spring and summer of 1883 moved with a sweetness that Theodora would remember for the rest of her life as the period when she understood fully what it meant to be at home. She was not a woman who had expected ease. She had not been raised to it, and she did not trust it particularly. But this was not ease. It was something more solid than ease, something that had been built carefully out of honesty and mutual respect, and the daily work of 2 people deciding, over and over, to be present to each other. She continued doing what she had been doing, the accounts, the kitchen, the garden that she had expanded in the spring to include vegetables Nathan had not grown before, and the riding on Tuesday who had become genuinely hers by now. She worked less of the heavy outdoor labor as the pregnancy progressed, not because Nathan told her to, but because she was practical about her own body and knew its limits. He was attentive without being suffocating, which was the precise balance she needed from him, and she told him so. He said, "I do not want to treat you as though being pregnant makes you less capable of knowing what you need." She said, "That is the correct position." He said, "Good. Then you will tell me when you need help." She said, "I always do." He said, "Yes, that is one of your best qualities." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, which made her laugh. David Ashe, the lawyer, had become a friend to both of them over the course of the water rights dispute, and he came out to the ranch for supper on a Sunday every few weeks through the summer. He was a bachelor, 28 years old, and he had the slightly adrift quality of a man who was competent at his work, and had not yet found the thing that made the rest of it make sense. Nathan noticed this and did not comment on it. Theodora noticed it and eventually, in her direct and unsentimental way, asked him about it. David Ashe said, "I suppose I am waiting for the right situation to present itself." Theodora said, "In my experience, situations do not always present themselves in the expected form. Sometimes you have to get on a stagecoach." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, and then looked thoughtful, which suggested her meaning had landed. Theodora's cousin in Denver, the one who had offered the teaching position that had brought her west in the first place, wrote in July to ask after her, having heard through some network of correspondence that she had married and settled in Colorado Territory rather than arriving in Denver. Theodora wrote back a full and honest account of what had happened, because she was not a woman who managed information for the comfort of others. Her cousin wrote back a letter that was equal parts astonishment and delight, and said that she had always known Theodora had more daring than sense, and that she was glad the daring had worked out. Theodora told Nathan about this letter, and he said, "More daring than sense. Is that accurate?" she said. "On this particular occasion, I think it turned out they were the same thing." He said, "I think you knew exactly what you were doing." She said, "I knew what I was hoping for. I did not know if it was possible." He said, "And now," she said, "now I know that it was." He looked at her in the late afternoon light of the kitchen, with her hair slightly loose from the day's work, and the particular glow that she had had since March that seemed less about pregnancy and more about being, finally, fully in the life she was supposed to be in. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that Clara Simmons staying in Ohio was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a Wednesday, in the house Nathan had built log by log, in the room that had been Theodora's first room at the ranch before it became their room. He was a healthy and thoroughly opinionated infant from his first hour, and Nathan held him with the careful, slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who has just understood that something he thought he wanted was actually something he needed. And Theodora watched Nathan hold their son, and felt a fullness in her chest that was simply beyond any word she could find for it. They named him James Fletcher Hudson, James for Theodora's father, Fletcher to keep the name she had carried, Hudson for the home they had built together. Pete, when he was brought in to see the baby, looked at the infant for a long time with an expression of tremendous gravity and then said, "He is going to be a handful," which was the highest compliment he knew how to give. James Fletcher Hudson was, in fact, a handful from the very beginning and with complete consistency, and Nathan and Theodora loved him extravagantly for it. He had Nathan's gray eyes and Theodora's direct gaze, and he was, by the time he could walk, as interested in the accounts on the kitchen table as in anything else, which made Theodora unreasonably proud. The ranch prospered through the mid-1880s in the way that well-managed land tends to prosper when the people working it are paying attention. The herd rotation Theodora had suggested in their first autumn together proved out exactly as she had predicted. By 1885, the south pasture was stronger and the feed costs were down, and the cattle they ran were healthier for it. Nathan's reputation in the surrounding area was good. He was known as a fair dealer and a reliable man, and when Callow Creek grew enough to establish a proper town council in 1884, he was asked to serve on it, which he did without great enthusiasm but with the steady conscientiousness that he applied to everything. Theodora was asked, in the spring of 1885, to teach school for a term, because the territory's schoolteacher had left Callow Creek to be married in Santa Fe, and the replacement had not yet arrived. She accepted immediately, and she taught 12 children of varying ages in the building that also served as a church and a town hall, and she was exactly as good at it as she had expected to be. The children liked her because she did not condescend to them, and she made the material interesting, and the parents liked her because the children came home with actual knowledge rather than simply the performance of it. David Ashe attended the end-of-term recitation that Theodora organized in June in the capacity of interested citizen, and sat in the back of the schoolroom watching 12 children demonstrate what they had learned. And at the end of it, Theodora introduced him to the new teacher who had arrived the previous week, a young woman of 24 named Margaret Keene from Massachusetts, who had come west with the same organization that had placed the previous teacher, and who was the kind of person who was clearly going to do very well in the Colorado territory because she had the same quality Theodora had recognized in Nathan 2 years ago. She was thoroughly, genuinely present in everything she did. David Ashe said hello to Margaret Keene in the way of a man who has just experienced a mild but significant disruption to his internal weather, and Margaret Keene responded with the calm directness of a woman who was aware of this effect and had decided to neither encourage nor discourage it before she knew more about the man causing it. Theodora watched this exchange from across the room with Nathan's hand at her back, and a feeling of warm satisfaction that she recognized as the particular pleasure of having been right about a situation she had not been certain about. Nathan bent down and said quietly into her hair, "Are you matchmaking?" she said, also quietly. "I am observing." "Matchmaking implies interference. I have not done anything," he said. "You introduced them," she said. "That is hospitality, not matchmaking." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and said, "You are absolutely matchmaking," and she smiled. David Ashe and Margaret Keene took 14 months to reach the same conclusion Nathan and Theodora had reached in 4 weeks, which was simply the difference in their respective natures. And they were married in the fall of 1886 in the same small church where Nathan and Theodora had been married 4 years before. And Reverend Birch performed the ceremony with exactly the same pleasure he had brought to the first one, because he had not yet lost his enthusiasm for weddings, which was one of the more durable enthusiasms a man in his position could have. Nathan and Theodora stood together at the wedding and watched their friends become something more, and Nathan put his arm around Theodora's shoulders and she leaned into him. And the thing between them that had started on a dusty platform with a woman who was not the expected woman holding a worn travel bag and asking for 10 minutes, that thing had grown, over 4.5 years, into something so fully realized and so deeply part of both of them that neither of them could precisely remember what the space before it had felt like, except that it had felt, in retrospect, like waiting. In 1887, James was 3 years old and the age at which children discover that questions are the most powerful tools available to any person of limited physical stature. He asked questions about the cattle and the horses and the weather and the accounts on the kitchen table, and on one memorable evening on the porch, about why the stars had names. Theodora sat with him on the porch steps in the summer dark and told him about Orion and Cassiopeia and the Big Dipper and Scorpius, and Nathan sat in the porch chair behind them and listened to her tell his son the stories he had heard her tell 2 years before for the first time, and the feeling he had then was the same feeling he had standing on the South Ridge looking at the view, the sense of being allowed for free to witness something exceptional. James said when Theodora had finished the story of Orion, "But Mama, how do you know all of them?" Theodora said, "My father taught me when I was not much bigger than you." James said, "Your papa, where is he?" Theodora said, "He has been gone for some years now, but I carry everything he taught me, and now I am giving it to you, so in a way it keeps going." James considered this with the seriousness of a 3-year-old who does not yet have the vocabulary for what he is understanding. Then he said, "Okay," and pointed at the sky and said, "Tell me that one," and she told him, and Nathan sat behind them in the warm dark and felt a gratitude so complete and so specific that it was almost a physical weight. Later, after James was in bed, Theodora came back out to the porch and sat beside Nathan in the chair he had put there for her, because he had, at some point in the previous years, added a second chair to the porch, which had started out as a practical consideration, and had become, to both of them, a small symbol of the fact that the porch was no longer his and the ranch was no longer his. It was theirs completely. In the way that things become when two people build a life together without reservation, she said, "He has your way of listening." Nathan said, "He has your way of asking questions." She said, "That is either a very good thing or a very challenging thing, depending on the hour." He said, "Both, I would think." She said, "Both." They sat in the evening quiet for a while, and then she said, "I have been thinking." He said, "About," she said, "the school. Margaret Ashe now, has been talking about the possibility of extending the school term through the winter months. The children in the territory are losing ground every winter because of the gap in education. She wants to petition the town council." Nathan said, "She should. It is the right idea." Theodora said, "She has asked if I would speak at the council meeting to support the petition." He looked at her. He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her I would talk to you first." He said, "Theodora, why would you need to talk to me first?" She said, "Because it would take time that I currently give to the ranch." He said, "The ranch will survive and the school matters. You know that it matters, and Margaret Ashe knows that you are the most effective speaker in Callow Creek because you do not waste a single word. Will you do it?" She looked at him and said, "Yes." He said, "Good. Then that is settled," she said. "You know that some men would not feel that way." He said, "Some men are not married to you. And some men have not had the experience of watching their wife build the legal case that saved their water rights, and then teaching school for a term, and then keeping the accounts for a cattle operation, all while raising a 3-year-old and managing this house. Those men may not have the full picture." She laughed. He loved that laugh. He would never stop loving that laugh. She said, "You give me rather a lot of credit." He said, "I give you exactly the right amount of credit. I am a precise man." She said, "You are." She leaned over and kissed him. There on the porch in the summer night, with the stars coming out over the mountains and the sound of cattle moving in the near pasture, and the faint glow of James's lamp still burning in the window of the house. And it was a kiss between two people who knew each other completely, every difficulty and every grace, every ordinary Tuesday and every extraordinary one. And it was the best kind of kiss there is, which is not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that has simply always been there, between two people who found each other by a route that made no conventional sense and every possible other kind. Theodora spoke at the town council meeting in September of 1887 in favor of the extended school term, and she did it with her characteristic economy of language and precision of argument. And the measure passed with a majority that Margaret Ashe said was larger than she had hoped for. The winter school term was established in Callow Creek, and then in 3 other communities in the surrounding area over the next 2 years, and it was part of the larger effort of the Colorado Territory in those years to build an infrastructure of education that the next generation of children would inherit. The second pregnancy announced itself in the spring of 1888, and this time Nathan knew before Theodora told him, because he had been paying attention for 5 years and he knew her face and her patterns the way he knew the patterns of the land he worked. He said, one morning in April while she was in the kitchen and he was on the way out to the barn, "Are you going to tell me something?" She turned and looked at him and said, "How do you always know before I say it?" He said, "I told you." "I pay attention," she said. "You learned that from me." He said, "I did," and there was a warmth in his voice that she felt across the kitchen like the stove coming on in the morning. Their daughter was born in December of 1888. As the snow came down outside the log walls of the house and James stood in the doorway of the room in his nightshirt, with an expression of profound suspicion about this new development in his previously orderly world. She had Theodora's brown hair and Nathan's stillness in her eyes, and they named her Clara, which was Theodora's idea. And when Nathan understood why she had chosen it, he looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the name did not already say, which was that Theodora Fletcher was a woman who honored the accident that had brought her to the right life by naming it part of that life's best things. James, once the initial suspicion wore off, became fiercely protective of his baby sister within approximately 4 days, which Pete observed with the comment that the boy had his father's instincts, meaning this as the highest praise. The ranch in the year 1890 was a different thing than it had been in the spring of 1882, when Nathan had first set ink to paper and sent a letter to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. It was larger. He had purchased an adjacent 160 acres in 1886, and better organized and more profitable, and it sat in the middle of a landscape that was still wild and still enormous, but was also now a place with neighbors and roads and a school, and a town that had grown enough to have 2 lawyers and a proper courthouse, and a doctor who was not also the barber, and all of that was both the progress of the territory and the work of the people in it. People like Nathan and Theodora, who had put their shoulders to the daily effort of building something that would last. Pete Sargent was 62 and had been with the ranch for 12 years and showed no signs of leaving, except that he had developed, over the previous couple of years, a habit of sitting on the porch in the evenings when Nathan and Theodora were not using it, and looking at the mountains with an expression of considerable contentment. Nathan had given him a permanent room in the main house rather than the bunkhouse 3 years ago, partly because the winters were hard and Pete was not as young as he had been, and partly because Pete had become, without anyone making a formal arrangement of it, as much a part of the family as anyone else, and it was time the accommodations reflected that. Pete had never married and had no family beyond the one he had found at this ranch, and Nathan and Theodora both understood this and treated it with the respect due to a fact that had never been spoken but was entirely clear. James called him Uncle Pete, which had started as a child's convenience and had become simply accurate. On an evening in the fall of 1890, Nathan and Theodora sat on the porch after supper with the stars coming out in that enormous Colorado sky, and James was inside with his astronomy book that Theodora had ordered from a catalog out of Chicago, because by 1890 you could order books from catalogs, which was a remarkable thing, and Clara was asleep. Pete was in the house somewhere, the sound of his footsteps audible through the log walls. Nathan said, "Are you happy?" Theodora turned to look at him. She said, "What a question," he said. "It is the most important one." She thought about it, which was what she did with everything. She did not give it away easily. She turned it over and looked at all of it. She thought about the woman she had been in the St. Louis depot in March of 1882, with $32 and a worn leather bag and an uncertain future, and the faint, stubborn conviction that she was capable of more than her circumstances were permitting. She thought about the 3-day stagecoach ride through country that grew larger and wilder and more astonishing with every hour. She thought about that platform, and the careful gray eyes, and the coffee, and the 10 minutes she had asked for that had turned into a month that had turned into 8 years. She thought about James asleep over his star book, and Clara curled in her crib, and Pete's footsteps in the house, and the porch that faced west, and the south pasture resting in its 2nd year, and the accounts book on the kitchen table with both their handwriting in it. She said, "Nathan, I am not just happy. I am the specific kind of happy that means you have found the exact right thing and you know it. I am happy in the way that is not fragile. Does that answer the question?" He looked at her, and she could see, in the lamplight that came through the window, the way his expression did the thing it always did when she said something that landed in the exact right place, the slight softening around the eyes, the quality of attention that was both completely still and completely present. He said, "Yes, that answers it." She said, "What about you?" He said, "I sent a letter to a stranger and asked her to come and work beside me and share my table and my life, and what came back was you. I think about that often. I think about the fact that a different letter came back, that you were not who I sent for, not on paper, not by the original arrangement. And I think that the distance between who I sent for and who arrived is exactly the distance between what I thought I wanted and what was actually right." She was quiet for a moment. She said, Clara Simmons is probably married to someone in Ohio who suits her perfectly. He said, I hope she is. I am grateful to her for staying. Theodora laughed. That is a generous way to put it. It is the accurate way, he said. She made a good decision for herself, and as a consequence, you made a better decision for both of us. She looked at him and said, I want you to know that I was terrified on that platform. I want you to know that I had rehearsed what I was going to say 40 times, and none of the rehearsals felt adequate. And when I saw you walking toward me, I thought, this is either going to be the moment everything turns right, or the moment I have to find my own way to Denver with $32 and a worn-out bag, and I was not at all certain which one it would be. He said, What made you certain it would be the first one? She said, You stopped. You came back to look at me a second time. A man who was simply dismissing the situation would not have come back to look. He said, I did not know I did that. She said, I know, that was the point. You did it because it was your honest response, not because you were managing the impression you were making. That was the moment I thought, this one. This is the one who means what he does. He reached over and took her hand there on the porch in the autumn of 1890 with the mountains dark against the stars and the house warm and full of the sounds of family, and he said, Theodora. She said, Yes. He said, I want you to know that every day of the past 8 years, I have been aware of what it cost you to come here, the courage of it. I have never forgotten that, and I am not going to forget it. She looked at him steadily. She said, It did not cost me anything I was not willing to pay, and what I received in return is not something I can put a number to, so the accounting does not balance in the usual sense. He said, How does it balance? She said, In the only way that matters, fully and in my favor and every single day. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, as he had done on that afternoon in the kitchen when the flour was still on her hands, and the gesture was the same as it had been then, formal and sincere and entirely without performance. And it meant now everything it had meant then and considerably more besides. Inside the house, James's voice called from his room that he could see Scorpius clearly from his window, and could someone please come and look. And the sound of it moved through the log walls and out through the window and onto the porch and into the night. And Theodora stood up and squeezed Nathan's hand and said, I will go. She went inside, and Nathan sat for a moment longer on the porch, looking up at the sky that he had been looking at for years from this same spot. And he heard, through the window, his wife's voice beginning the story of Scorpius, the great scorpion sent by the earth goddess, the one that chased Orion across the sky, and his son's voice asking the question about why they could never both be in the sky at the same time, and Theodora's answer, which was that some stories could only be told across a distance. But that did not make them less true. He sat there in the dark and the quiet and the brilliant stars, and he thought about letters. He thought about the one he had written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis in the early months of 1882, the honest letter about a ranch that was not much to look at, and a man who was reliable if not romantic. He thought about the letter that had come back changed, not his letter returning to him, but a different one, the one that Theodora had written to the agency before she boarded the stage. The brief, careful letter in which she had introduced herself and explained the situation and asked to be considered. He had found that letter in the agency's files when he had, some years later, requested his file for his own records, and he had read it and understood that she had been just as honest with the agency as he had been, and that her description of herself, practical, educated, capable of physical work, direct in manner, willing for frontier life had matched her exactly, and also told only a fraction of the truth about her. Because no letter could capture the particular quality of a person who sees the world clearly and engages with it fully and finds it, despite everything, genuinely wonderful. He could hear the voice of the story still coming through the window, and Clara making small sounds in her sleep that meant she was not fully awake, but was registering the voices of her family around her as she always did, and Pete's slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway, and the sound of the cattle settling in the near pasture, and the wind moving through the cottonwood trees along the creek. He stood up from his porch chair, the porch that had two chairs now, both of them worn to the shape of the people who used them, which was its own kind of record, and he went inside to listen to the story about Scorpius. He sat beside Theodora at the window in James's room, and James was pointing out the constellation with the authority of a 7-year-old who has recently learned something he considers urgent. And Clara had woken slightly, and was sitting up in the crib in the adjoining room, making it clear that she had opinions about the fact that a story was being told without her. And Pete appeared in the doorway because the voices had reached him, and he was, as Theodora had known from the first winter, constitutionally incapable of not attending to the family's activities, and the room was full of light and voices, and the particular warm disorder of a house that is being lived in completely. Nathan looked at Theodora across the top of James's head, and she looked back at him, and in that look was everything: the platform and the coffee, the porch and the stars, the water rights and the accounts and the barn roof, and the 400 acres that had become 560, and James and Clara and Pete and David Ash and Margaret and Reverend Birch and Harriet Plum, and all of Callow Creek growing up around them year by year. And the $32 and the worn leather bag and the 3-day stagecoach ride through the enormous country, and the letter he had written to a stranger, and the woman who had come back in the stranger's place, better than the one described, better than he had known to ask for, better than he had deserved by any accounting he could make, which was the thing he would spend the rest of his life doing his best to deserve more fully. She raised an eyebrow slightly, which was Theodora's shorthand for "Are you all right?" and he gave her a small nod, which was his shorthand for "entirely," and she smiled, which needed no translation at all. Outside, the Colorado sky arched enormous and brilliant over the log house and the barn, and the 560 acres of good cattle country, and the stars were precisely where they had always been, and the story of Scorpius came to its end. And James said, "Tell me another one." And Theodora Fletcher Hudson, who could name every constellation visible from the northern hemisphere and tell the mythology behind most of them, and who had learned this from a father she carried forward and was now carrying forward again, said yes and began.